We're going forward again. On the way we take a quick look at the recent battlefield. Quite a lot of enemy corpses. I was told that they saw an armoured personnel carrier hit. From the enemy side, the slopes of the heights are quite gentle. Unlike us, the enemy had every opportunity to manoeuvre, especially with equipment. We quickly began to move forward. Without much effort seized another height, which on military maps was designated by the number 503. Occupying an advantageous position, the battery from height 517 for 3 more days fired at the enemy positions, and only when the range of fire began to approach the limit, the battery began to change position, catching up with our troops who had gone forward. On the way we passed the small town of Modri Cayman. It was located in a rather narrow gorge, in the middle of which flowed a small river, and on the other side of it, clinging to the rocks, stood cosy houses drowned in the greenery of coniferous trees. We were in a hurry, and did not even have a chance to stay in town for at least an hour. In summer it is especially beautiful here, I think. By evening the battalion, which was supported by my battery, was entrenched on the crest of a mountain spur. Here we'll pass the time until morning. The battalion commander settled down near a large rock, 2 meters high and about the same width. The soldiers stretched some tents, lit a blowtorch, which they used to warm the big boulder. It was quite tolerable, even warm, especially since the battery foreman had sent me a wicker with a 10-litre bottle of grape wine in it. We lay on the pine and sipped the sour wine. Soon the fatigue and tension of the past day did its work, and we fell asleep. The night in the mountains is cold, but the blowtorch worked reliably and heated us. The soldiers, of course, had a harder time. In the morning after breakfast the battalion was raised to the attack, expecting to continue the offensive, but the enemy offered stubborn resistance, and the battalion lay down, pinned down by rifle and machine gun fire. Soon the enemy tried to counterattack. The battalion and my battery had to repel the counterattack. The fight lasted all day, but neither we nor Hitlerites managed to change the position of the sides. I carefully studied the enemy's defense in the stereotube, trying to find machine gun nests, which did not allow the battalion to develop the offensive. I noticed that the enemy's machine guns are similar to ours in rate of fire. The German machine guns have a higher rate of fire. Soldiers' helmets of the enemy also look more like ours. Soon I noticed behind one of the stones a papaha, similar to the Chapayev's, which was worn by my friend, the commander of the 5th Battery Kazimir Kaminsky. I called Kazimir and asked him to raise his papa over the rock on a stick. He asks with astonishment why I explain to him that I'm watching my opponent, but I can kind of see him. He laughed that I was obviously hallucinating, but raised his cap. I informed him that I could see him on the enemy's side. He in turn asked that I raise my cap. He was surprised to hear that he saw me, or rather my hat, on the enemy's side. It was clear we were fighting each other. We decided to report this to our battalion commanders. The commanders didn't believe it, but just in case they went to the stereo chimneys. What was the surprise and amazement when the commanders recognized each other? It turns out that the 1st Battalion had been fighting with the 2nd Battalion all day. We reported about it to the regiment. Soon the regimental command arrived to find out what was going on. It turned out that the night before the battalions went on different spurs, which in some place converged in front of each other, which led to confusion. While the battalions were fighting with each other, the enemy managed to move away to a decent distance, and all the next day we had to chase him to prevent him from gaining a foothold on a favourable line. And we had a lesson for the future: the mountains are no joke. For several days we have been fighting in mountainous and wooded areas. The weather was the worst: rain with snow, cold, damp wind, icy rocks. Overcoats were soaked through, swollen, and by evening they were covered with ice crust. At night we escaped from the cold somewhere behind a big stone or a rock ledge. It is good if we are near the battalion commander who has a blowtorch. Somehow it helps to have wine, which is brought by my ordinarets in the evening, an invariable lash. There is a sea of wine here. Soon the order is to surrender our section to another division, and we come down from the mountains and continue the offensive along them, so that they remain on our right. But still we are down, here are fields, arable land and warmer than in the mountains, although there is much more mud. The enemy, having realized the futility of resistance, is retreating, trying to get behind the River Gron and organize defense there. Well, and we need to pursue him faster to prevent him from gaining a foothold. We go practically without fighting, not counting small skirmishes with the German rearguard. It's the first time I see my battery altogether. We move in one column on the asphalt highway, following the battalion. My battery is horse-drawn. Each gun is pulled by 6 horses besides. Each gun has several wagons with property and ammunition. Each gun number should have a riding horse, but there are none, so the soldiers of the units ride on wagons. I am ahead of the battery on a beautiful, slender stallion dark grey with apples, on the sides white. This is the horse that in Romania we took in the royal cart, behind me riding platoon commander Diminsky and scouts. I, like a cavalryman, have spurs on my boots, on the left side of the checker. However, these attributes were the usual uniform of every artillery officer. The picture is impressive. The column is moving in the correct formation at the proper distances. Rested horses are easy trotting, knocking out sparks with horseshoes. We pass a small Czechoslovakian town of Levas. In the nearest village we stop for the night. The river Hron is not far ahead, our defence is on it. The enemy is on the opposite bank. Judging by the map, the river is small. Its width does not exceed 100 metres. But here the river comes out of the mountains, and the current, of course, strong. In addition, the winter is warm and the river does not freeze. As it turned out later, it was so. This is all to the fact that we had to force it. Meanwhile, the 1st Battalion of the 13th Guards Airborne Regiment, which I support, was ordered to defend the village of Tikau-Breznica, replacing there the Cavalry Corps units. I could hardly find this village on the map. It is located on the bank of the River Gron in a mountain valley. There is a highway and a railroad to it, but all this is along the river, and the enemy, of course, will not allow us to move along the road. It is under his constant aim. We are looking on the map for how to get to this village. The map shows a forest road along the gorge. Apparently it is a logging road. While I was solving the issues of material support of the battery ammunition, food, forage and others, the battalion, which my battery supports, went forward. The battery moved on the road at noon. Soon the road entered a rather dense coniferous forest. I am ahead on my horse with me scouts with platoon commander Diminsky. The road gradually rises higher and higher into the mountains. Soon on the right and left through the trees showed bare rocks. The gorge began. To the right and left the slopes of the mountain range go steeply upwards. It is much colder here than where we left from. There is snow everywhere. We have been moving for 2 hours already. It is time to choose a firing position, but there is a dense forest around. Soon we came to the edge of the forest. Further the terrain lowers, and it is obvious from everything that there were forestry operations here. Near the edge of the forest there is a clearing, a forest clearing. It is quite suitable for a firing position. I set a task to the senior officer of the battery to take the firing position and prepare the battery for firing. The firing sector is rather narrow. It is limited by mountain ridges on the right and left, but there is no other way out. And in general, the place for the op is not bad. There is a place to put guns and equip dugouts. Well, me and the control platoon should continue the way forward to the village Tikau-Breznica. According to the map, it is on the bank of the River Gron, along which the front runs. We reached the village without incident when it started to get dark. We crossed the crest of the height that closed the entrance to the gorge from the side of the village, and we saw the whole village like in the palm of our hand. Behind the village we could guess the riverbed. Behind it the terrain goes gently upwards, and further, about 2 kilometres away, a mountain ridge at least a kilometre high rises sharply upwards. The whole area is covered with a deep white layer of snow. A small village can be seen on the other side. The street running from the river towards the mountain range is clearly visible. A village is also visible on the left in the distance, but it is about 4 kilometres away, and you can't see it well in the evening haze. Between the villages is a rather large snow-covered field. The enemy does not reveal himself in any way. No shot, no noise, no defensive structures are visible. Obviously the snow has reliably covered the enemy defences. According to the map, there is a small town of Nova Banja on the right side. It is about 7 kilometres away, and it is not visible, but soon we heard the sounds of church bells from there. There is also a church in the centre of the village where we arrived. We moved forward, into the village. Not a soul on the streets, the front is near. Only on the right outskirts, sometimes a battalion soldier will run from hut to hut. Not far from the centre of the village and the church is a rather large one-story house on a hill. The windows are paneless, and to all appearances, no one lives there. Underneath the house is a massive stone bunker. Apparently, from the roof of the house there will be a good view of the terrain on the enemy side. We head towards this house and leave our horses at the back of it. Together with the platoon commander Diminsky and scouts inspect the house. There is really no one lives in it. Apparently it belongs to some rich man. There are no furnishings in the house, besides we are not interested in them. We climb up into the attic, roofs made of good shingles. We take out a few of them, and the opposite bank of the River Gron as on the palm of our hands. There's no better observation point. I order to equip here an observation post, send a scout to inspect the bunker under the house. There we will rest and shelter from shells and bombs of the enemy. It gets dark quickly, and we descend from the attic. The scout sent to reconnoitre the bunker reports that the local population, mostly women, children and old people, are hiding there. We enter the basement. Massive iron doors and a huge room. A few candles shine dimly, in the shaky light of which we can see the villagers lying on the floor. We stopped at the entrance. We are quickly surrounded by young people, mostly girls and a few young boys. A lively conversation ensues. The village is mostly Slovak, and we can understand their speech as well as ours. Of course, not all the words can be understood at once, but the meaning is clear. We settle down at the entrance on the floor, where there is some straw. My soldiers are not lost, chatting cheerfully with the local girls, who are obviously bored without their peer boys. The previous day has been a busy one, and we quickly fall asleep with our guards posted. In the morning, with dawn, I go up to my NP, to the attic. The scouts on duty didn't waste time. They dismantled the hog and made a protective wall of bricks in the form of a big letter C to protect the front and flanks from bullets and shell splinters. For more than an hour I sit at the stereo tube, observing the terrain on the enemy's side, especially the village. Usually early in the morning and late in the evening one can detect movement at the Hitlerites. When the kitchen arrives and gives out food, ammunition is brought up, etc., but no movement can be seen. Everything is covered with a thick layer of blinding white snow. I leave Diminsky with scouts at the NP. After a quick snack, I went to the battalion commander, agreed on cooperation, and that I with my battery occupy the left half of the village, and he the right. There are a little more men in the battalion than in my battery. We have to find a house where we could live while we are in this village. I stayed in the nearest house. The owner was quite prosperous. The house was spacious. I was given a rather large room with a double bed, a table and other furniture. Soon the deputy commander of the division, Captain Yurchenko, came to my battery on horseback. He will be here, so decided the division commander, obviously because I commanded the battery recently, and to help would not hurt to have a more experienced officer. He was placed in the same room as me. Having consulted with him, I decided to settle my petty officer and his household in the village, and to bring the horses of the gun carriages here. It would be easier to feed them here. In the forest, where they are now, there is no other fodder except coniferous branches. I chose a place closer to the left outskirts, and by evening the petty officer and horses were in the village. The usual front-line work began. From early morning I climbed on the roof of the house in my NP and carefully studied literally every metre of the observation strip. But there was no sign of the enemy, not a single shot, at least from a rifle or automatic rifle. Nor was there any movement either in the early morning, afternoon or evening. One had the impression that the Germans were not there at all. But the civilian population did not show its presence in the village either. Not a single stove was being stoked. No movement between the houses was visible. This told us that there was still an enemy in the village. Realizing that sooner or later we would have to fight here, I decided to shoot a number of points, or, as they say in artillery, repairs in my observation line, so that in case of necessity it would be possible to open fire quickly to hit the target without shooting. For several days I was shooting, recording the gun settings on these repairs. The enemy did not show any reaction. at the firing position of the battery brought in sufficient quantities of fragmentation grenades with a fuse for ricochet firing. They differed in that when they hit the ground the fuse was triggered with a delay. During this time the projectile had time to ricochet off the ground and burst in the air. This increased the killability of the target, because when exploding on the ground, some of the shell fragments went into the ground. I fired several shots at the village, which was located just across the river against our village. The shells fell precisely along the street going up the slope. The shards cut the roof tiles. I calculated that in some of the roofs there must be an enemy NP, and maybe even firing points. Apparently the enemy did not like such shelling. In any case, from the village I heard several machine gun bursts from the houses, almost at the very bank of the river. Unfortunately, these houses were poorly visible because of trees and bushes, but it was already good that the enemy had discovered himself. There was a rather funny incident during this period. At the firing position there was an unpleasant incident. The senior officer of the battery beat up a soldier. I don't remember what the reason was, but I thought that such actions on the part of the officer were unacceptable. I reported this incident to the division commander, and the senior officer on the battery was removed. There were no officers left at the firing position. I decided to send there the commander of the control platoon, Diminsky. He tearfully asked me not to send him to the firing position, as he had never been a platoon commander. Of course, his request was justified. The senior officer of the battery has a lot of duties and needs a solid knowledge of the fire service manual, without which it is impossible to ensure reliable fire control of the battery. Practical experience is needed here. The senior battery officer is actually the deputy battery commander. I myself had little experience in this matter. For 2 months I was a commander of a firing platoon, and that was during a period when the regiment was on reorganization, in May-June 1943, on the Northwestern Front. Our battery was in a firing position, but we did not fire. It was far away from the front, at least 40 kilometers. I had no other option, and I ordered Diminsky to go to the firing position and fulfill the duties of the senior officer of the battery, promising him that at the first opportunity I would relieve him of these duties. Soon I fulfilled this promise. I was sent Junior Lieutenant Doroshenko as senior officer of the battery. He was a sergeant, finished a 3-month course of junior officers, and arrived at the battery. He knew the fire service and coped well with his duties. But that was later, about a week later, and in the meantime Diminsky went to the firing position. The next morning I continued to shoot the repos. I give the command to set the directing angle on the target, level, sight, etc. I give the command fire. I carefully observe the area where the repeater is located. A gap should appear there. The terrain there is relatively flat, obviously an arable field, but now everything is covered with snow. Against its background the rupture should be clearly visible. The time of flight of the shell is a few seconds. About a minute has passed, and there is no rupture. I call on the phone to the firing position, asking if there was a shot. The telephonist answers uncertainly that there was a shot. I call Diminsky to the phone, ask the same question and get the same answer. I ask, what's the matter? Why the uncertain report? If there was a shot, then the bolt should open. In these guns, the breech block opens automatically when the shot is fired, and the energy of the barrel recoil during the shot is used to operate the automatics. Diminsky reports that the gun breech is closed and smoke is slowly coming out of the barrel. I thought that maybe it was a prolonged firing. Such a case is possible when the powder charge is damp. I ordered to take the crew away from the gun to the shelter. A few minutes passed. I called Diminsky again. He reports that there are no changes. The smoke is still slowly coming. I order to open the bolt manually. After a few minutes, Diminsky replies that the bolt does not open. I know that this is possible when the loader forcefully sends the shell into the barrel, and the brass leading belt is cut into the rifling of the barrel, and the bolt opens with difficulty. Taking into account Diminsky's inexperience, I ordered him to remove the crew from the gun and sent the artillery master, who was here in the village at that moment, to the firing position. It took more than an hour for the artilleryman to reach the firing position. Soon he reports to me by telephone that everything is in order. We can continue firing. I naturally asked what happened. He replied that nothing had happened, the shot had been fired, but since it was the first shot of the day, and the air temperature was about -10 to 15 degrees Celsius, the steel had thickened, the recoil was incomplete, the bolt did not open, and the cartridge case did not fly out of the breech. I ordered to scrutinize the barrel channel and the cartridge case, and I was thinking, where did the shell go? In such a case, there must have been an underflight. I took into account such a probability and increased the sight setting to 200 meters, but there was no rupture. Maybe the shell had not exploded? Soon the artilleryman reported that the barrel was fine, but the shell casing was from a shell for the regimental gun. On the flange of the shell casing there is a notch indicating this, but it was not paid attention to. I figured it out. The thing is that the caliber of the regimental gun is 76 mm, like our divisional gun, but it has a short barrel and the charge is reduced. Ammunition from the regimental gun fit ours. I quickly determined on the map where the shell could fly away. It turned out that it did not fly to our village, and it's good that it didn't hit the village. But then, in a casual conversation, I learned that the shell fell on the firing position of battalion mortars. Fortunately, at that moment there was no one at the mortars and no one was hurt, and it was a lesson for me. I called Diminsky to the phone and implored him to be attentive to the duties of a senior officer, to check all the guns and ammunition personally, and not to hesitate to ask what he did not know from the sergeants and soldiers of the squads. Diminsky again tearfully asks to be relieved of his duties as a senior officer. For a few hours in this position, he says, has suffered more trouble than for the entire time in the previous position, although it is also not sugar all the time on the front line, with all the ensuing consequences. I confirmed my promise, but for the time being I required him to fulfill the duties of a senior officer. Further firing of the battery passed without complications. After the war, in the 80s, when my younger son Yevgeny studied at the Kiev Higher Military Aviation Engineering School, I came to visit him and found Diminsky in Kiev, who worked in the Supreme Council of Ukraine and held there a rather solid post of the head of the awards department. He lived in a government house on Rusanovskaya embankment of the Dnieper. We met, recalled the front life, including the episode I have described here. Diminsky remembered it in all details. We laughed, sat over a bottle of cognac, remembering the years of war and his fellow soldiers, living and dead. On the same ill-fated day there was another memorable incident that almost cost us our lives. Having finished shooting, I climbed down from the roof, where my NP was located, and went to the house where we lived with Captain Yurchenko. He was in his room writing a letter to his wife. He wrote to her quite often, and almost everyone had a poem that he composed himself. The poems were naive, of course, but from the heart. He sometimes let me read them to him. It was lunchtime. My orderly was going to bring a pot of lunch any minute. I sat down at the table opposite the window and delved into my shooting records. It was cold on the NP, my hands were freezing, and I had to decipher and write down all the calculations and firing data. Outside the window in the yard, about 20 to 25 meters from our windows, the owner of the house was tarring a stabbed boar. Suddenly there was a sharp whistle of a shell. We knew well from the sound that this shell was flying towards us. Instantly we fell on the floor under the table. This saved our lives. The shell exploded in the yard, not far from the boar that was lying down. The blast wave blew out both our windows, along with the frames. Shrapnel riddled the entire wall where we were sitting. The plaster from the ceiling and walls collapsed in many places. The room was filled with dust and smoke. We quickly jumped out of the room into the yard and ran outside. The second shell could hit the house, especially if there was a fire attack. We ran 100 meters to the bunker under the house, where my NP was. Its door was facing the direction from which the enemy shell came, so we took cover behind the walls of the house on the other side of the entrance to the bunker. Both of us were covered head to toe in lime dust, but that was not the point now. We waited for about 15 minutes. To our surprise, no shots were fired again. We went to the house, where our clothes and the unpretentious articles of our closet were left. The picture was terrible. The explosion had scattered everything in the yard. Judging by the crater and the force of the explosion, it was a heavy shell of 155 millimeters caliber. If it had hit the house, it would have left only ruins. The explosion blew the boar to pieces. Pieces of meat stuck to the walls of the house and hung on the trees near it. The whole wall was riddled with splinters, and not far away lay the owner of the house with his leg torn off, bleeding. How he had managed in a fever, without a leg, to run, or rather to skip 25 meters on one leg, it is difficult to say. He was unconscious. We tried to give him first aid, but we had neither the experience nor the means to do so. Besides, soon a sanitary instructor came running with a bag and began to give the wounded first aid, making sure that we were not hurt. We hardly found our things and went to another house, where the foreman of my battery was with his household. On February 10th, 1945, late in the evening in one of the houses on the outskirts where my battery was located, suddenly entered the house 3 men with weapons, who introduced themselves as scouts of a partisan detachment operating in the mountains, on the other side of the River Gron. They needed to contact our command. The battalion commander assigned them 2 escorts and sent them to the headquarters of his regiment. As I later learned, the partisan brigade in question was ordered to cross the front line and join the active troops in that direction. The basis of the partisan detachment were paratroopers led by the commander of the detachment, Lieutenant Colonel Avdiv, in the rear of the enemy Czechoslovak patriots, and those who hated the fascist invaders from other European countries joined them. So the detachment was international. Moreover, as it became known later, besides partisans, the detachment had quite a large number of prisoners, mostly from among the Hungarians. Hungary was fighting against us on the side of fascist Germany. Soon it became known that the partisan detachment would be crossing the Gron River near the village of Tikau-Breznica, where we were located. I was instructed by the division commander to ensure by the fire of guns that this detachment would cross the front line and cross the Gron. I was transported a sufficient amount of ammunition and also reinforced the battery with 2 122mm howitzers. The thing is that my guns, having a decent range of 12 kilometers, were limited in maneuvering fire along the front, because to the right and left towered mountain ranges of kilometer height. Cannons could not shoot there, the angle of elevation of the barrel did not allow. Howitzers had better opportunities in this respect. They could shoot even at an elevation angle of 80 degrees. Howitzers stood next to my guns at the same position. On February 13th, 1945, in the evening, a large command arrived at my NP, the commander of the artillery division, Colonel Jurievsky, the commander of our regiment, Major I.P. Lebedev, the division commander, Captain I.D. Savin, and accompanying them. I reported to the chief the situation, shot repairs and readiness of the battery to fulfill the task. The superiors were satisfied. From my NP was perfectly visible place where the partisan detachment was to cross the front line and the River Gron. It was already dark, but the white snow allowed against the background of dark mountains to see this area. Soon, somewhere in the distance, in the mountains on the enemy's side, gunfire was heard. Flares hung in the air, obviously. The guerrillas had come across the enemy's combat guard. In order for the battery to fire, it was determined that the guerrillas would give a signal with a red rocket in the direction in which to fire. So far there was no such signal, and we looked with tension to where the sounds of battle could be heard. The firing on the other side of the river was getting closer. Soon we also saw the signal to support the battle of the detachment by the fire of the guns. We had to suppress enemy fire from the outskirts of the village, which was to our left on the other bank. I had a repeater there, and I immediately opened fire on the enemy with rapid fire from all the guns. The bursts were clearly visible, and soon the firing on the partisans from that side of the village ceased. It was guessed in the darkness that the detachment had approached the river and had begun to cross it. To ensure the crossing and help the guerrillas, I allocated several pairs of horses and the necessary number of soldiers. The sappers stretched a cable, and with the help of horses the crossing was carried out. The river is mountainous, very fast, deep enough, and of course the water is icy. But as it became known later, the crossing was quick. The artillery commander got into the taste and decided to give a salvo from the guns of the fighter anti-tank regiment, which was at a distance of almost 10 kilometers from us. The regiment had the same guns as my battery. I expressed doubts about the expediency of this volley, because the regiment had to shoot almost at the extreme range. which means that there would be a large dispersion of shells and, instead of helping, you can hit your own. In addition, I knew that the fighter regiment was designed to fight with tanks' direct fire. For them, firing from closed positions was a secondary matter, and I knew from previous experience that in this matter the Iptapovs were not very well prepared. But my superiors decided in their own way. The command to fire, i.e., to fire a regimental salvo, came over the radio. Before we heard the volley of guns, one of the shells fired by the regiment hit the roof of our house. There was a deafening explosion, fortunately in the far corner of the roof. Shrapnel whistled. Everyone on the roof went down. The attic we were in was accessed by a ladder attached to an opening in the ceiling of the house. Next to it was another hole in the ceiling. It was left over from dismantling the brick for the NP. This opening led directly into a tiled stove that was downstairs in one of the rooms of the house. In the darkness and commotion, one of our guests fell into that hole. It was dark, you couldn't see anything. And you couldn't turn on the light, the front line was nearby, and the enemy was only 500 to 600 meters away. When we started to sort things out, we couldn't find the artillery commander, Colonel Jurievsky. When we started looking for him, we heard swearing, muffled by the walls of the rooms. When we ran up there, we realized what was going on. The commander had fallen right into the stove, and in addition, a nurse who had been brought with him by our regimental commander had fallen on top of him. They quickly broke down the furnace and pulled out the commander, and then the nurse. The case, of course, is comical, but at that moment it was no laughing matter. We checked everyone who was at the NP. Fortunately, there were no wounded or killed. The superiors were in no mood to resume firing. I was ordered to continue to independently provide fire for the passage of the guerrilla detachment. With that, the commanders left. Only then, the next day, sorting out all the vicissitudes of the night, we laughed heartily. The crossing of the Partisan detachment across the River Gron continued. The artillery fire of my battery apparently forced the Germans to abandon the pursuit of the guerrillas. Along the outskirts of the village nearest to the crossing, occupied by the enemy, the battery put NZO. Shell after shell flew in that direction, not allowing the enemy to organize the pursuit of the guerrilla detachment. Only machine gun bursts were heard. Mortar battery of the enemy was suppressed by the fire of my battery at the very beginning of the battle, and now did not fire. By midnight on February 14th, the Partisan detachment of Lieutenant Colonel Avdiv finished crossing the Gron River. It was subsequently disbanded. Partisans from the Soviet Union joined our regiments, and the rest, according to their wishes, joined the International Battalion. This battalion was transferred to the 3rd Guards Airborne Regiment of our division. It was commanded by Captain Kolutiev, and the commissar was the Czech Mizjarek. The operation of the Partisan detachment crossing the front line was later included in the 6-volume book The Great Patriotic War as a classic example of tactical interaction between the front troops and the Partisan detachment. 2 or 3 days passed, and I receive an order to return to my division and occupy the NP near the village of Pukanitz. A similar order was received by the commander of the battalion I was supporting. Obviously, we were sent here to ensure the transition of the Partisan detachment. By noon the next day, I with the battery was already in the division. The battery took up a firing position near a village. I don't remember its name. NP was organized near the village of Pukanitz. It stood on the very bank of the River Gron, about 15 kilometers from the village Tekau-Breznica, downstream of the river. The opposite bank was clearly visible from the NP, but the river itself and the coastal area could not be seen, because of the rocky outcrops in front, behind which the mountains steeply stepped down to the river. Here we already fought with great comfort at night. On the NP remained on duty officer, scouts and communicators from each battery. The rest went down to the village in the evening and slept in houses. And early in the morning they were again at the station. On the 2nd or 3rd day after my arrival at the new NP, I was on night duty at the observation post. The night passed quietly, but early in the morning, when the sun had not yet risen, and there was quite a thick haze, a scout who was on duty near the observation devices ran into the dugout. He shouted in excitement Germans. I immediately jumped out of the dugout, which was next to the observation cells. I looked in the direction where the scout was pointing. Indeed, about 150 meters away there is a chain of German soldiers. I commanded the scouts to open fire with automatic rifles on the enemy. I grab a stereo tube, the scout takes a bussel, the communicators hastily disconnect the phones, and we, under cover of fire of our scouts, quickly retreat back. There is no time to rewind the communication line. The Germans for some time were pressed to the ground by the fire of scouts, but now they came to their senses and opened a strong fire on us. Our 3 automatic rifles, of course, could not stop the German battalion, and the Germans soon began to move forward again, trying to surround us. The thing is that there were no infantry nearby. It was believed that the river and the mountains reliably provide this section of the front, so the enemy decided to punish us. Before leaving the op, I managed to transmit the situation to the division headquarters and to give a command to the firing position of my battery to fight. At the op, the senior officer of the battery, obviously by the machine gun bursts, realized what was going on and prepared to direct fire, but he was afraid to hit us, as the visibility was still poor. Soon there was a raid of enemy aviation on our battle orders. My battery had recently taken a firing position, and the enemy had not yet discovered it, so it did not suffer from the bombing. Our infantry also entered the battle. 2 hours passed, we withdrew about a kilometre, opened fire guns of my and neighbouring batteries. The enemy was forced to lie down. Soon our infantry made a flank counterattack. A firefight ensued. The enemy entrenched on the slopes of the mountains and well saw our infantry, making a counterattack, pouring its strong fire of machine guns, automatic rifles and mortars. A strong battle was simmering all day long. My battery supported the counterattack of our troops, destroying enemy fire points. By the end of the day, the enemy was knocked out of the occupied positions and pushed back behind the River Gron. As it became known later, the Germans, covering themselves with poor visibility of the river section between the villages Tikau-Breznica and Pukanek and the absence of our troops, crossed the river at night and suddenly attacked us, trying to take revenge for the passage of the Partisan detachment across the front line. The next day, Romanian troops arrived at our positions, to whom we handed over our defensive section, including me handed over my NP to a Romanian officer artillerist. We moved 15 kilometres down the Gron River, where our offensive operation was to begin. By the end of the day, when it was already dark, we took the battle order in the new direction. My NP was on the edge of the village, in the cemetery. Here my scouts and communicators next to the graves dug cells for observation and installed devices. Nearby were the NPs of our other batteries and the commander of our division. Visibility was very poor. Constant thick haze and fog from the river made it impossible to see the depth of the enemy's defences. We observed only the opposite bank and the trees that covered the houses of the village on the other side. But there was no other choice. The troops were pulled up here. The positions of our troops were equipped here in advance. For the first time, my battery was placed on a position prepared by sappers, with trenches and even dugouts. Due to the proximity of the Germans, engineering works were not carried out at the NP in order not to attract their attention, so we equipped it ourselves. All night long ammunition was brought to the firing position. Never before had there been so many shells on the battery. This testified to the fact that they were working hard in the rear. We were preparing data for firing. In addition, we had to receive and sort the ammunition, to remove the residue from them, etc. In the morning, the artillery preparation was to begin, followed by the advance of our troops. The river fording had to take place during the period of artillery-free preparation, so we had special requirements. Not a single shell should not fall into the river and hit our own. Meanwhile, the width of the river is less than 100 meters, and the enemy's leading edge close to the shore. In this case, it is usually said that from the artillerymen required jewellery work. This can be understood if we take into account that the normal dispersion of shells when firing is not less than 200 meters, and we have to strike at the front edge of the enemy, which is closer than 200 meters from our front edge. There is a lot to work on. Offensive always caused both soldiers and officers a sense of excitement. It was awaited and prepared with impatience, although they knew perfectly well that any attack is always associated with greater losses than in the defence. Defence exhausted inactivity, if this word is applicable to combat. But even here there was enough work in abundance, especially physical work. It was necessary to dig many kilometers of trenches, dugouts, and all this was done by soldiers and officers, and mostly with elementary means a soldier's shovel, and often a helmet and a bowler hat were also used. In the vicinity of the enemy, under his fire influence, you can't work with a trowel, and a soldier without a trench feels defenseless. A stray bullet or shrapnel, not to mention bombing or artillery fire, could either kill or wound. This was well understood at the front, and there was no need for any command for digging. The soldiers themselves dug a shelter for themselves whenever possible. At the same time, they knew well that this work was becoming useless, because sooner or later the offensive would begin and the trench would not be needed. In addition, the defence did not solve the main task, the liberation of the territory occupied by the enemy. This caused a feeling of dissatisfaction, although everyone understood that before conducting an offensive, it was necessary to have the forces and means for it, and time and defence were needed to create the conditions for it. On March 25, 1945, the offensive of the right wing of the Second Ukrainian Front began. As it should, it began with a powerful artillery preparation. The operation that began was limited in the number of troops and the objectives of the offensive. In this regard, the amount of artillery engaged for its conduct was relatively small. Therefore, the artillerymen had additional and difficult tasks it was necessary to make up for the lack of artillery by increasing the intensity of artillery fire. That is, each gun had to fire significantly more shells than in a conventional artillery offensive. On March 25, 1945, the weather was overcast and visibility was very poor. There was little intelligence about the enemy defences, and the artillery began artillery preparation by firing on the areas. Artillery headquarters, knowing the approximate structure of the enemy's defence, divided it into separate sections, and each division received its own section on the first and subsequent lines of the enemy's defence. The artillery preparation began, as usual, with a salvo of Katyusha rocket launchers. For the first time my artillerymen were firing at maximum rate. One by one I gave a command to the firing positions, for example, plot 102. 24 shells volley fire. The gun crews loaded the guns with the highest possible speed and fired 24 shells each. It was accepted in artillery that this was the maximum number of shells possible for a fire raid. After such an expenditure of shells, at least a minute's pause was needed for the gun barrel to cool down. During this pause, soldiers usually poured cold water over the hot barrel. The point is that when the barrel was heated due to the expansion of the metal, the accuracy of firing deteriorated and the dispersion increased, and some shells could deflect to the side nearest to our troops and even hit their own. Because the infantry during the artillery preparation moves to the attack line to break into the enemy's trenches with a single jerk, while the artillery will transfer the fire to the next line. In addition, the calculations need to restore the gun's aiming, broken by the firing of cursory fire. One raid after another followed with minimal intervals. Although it was quite cool, 5 degrees Celsius, the soldiers took off their overcoats, and the loaders and gymnasies, and in sweat, literally, worked at the guns. The continuous rumble of shots and bursts merged into a mighty roar of artillery cannonade. Under the cover of artillery fire, our paratroopers began forcing the River Gron. Although, as I said, its width did not exceed 100 meters, but the rapid flow of the river made it difficult to ford. Nevertheless, our advanced units managed to force the river and engage the enemy on the other side. The front line, or rather, the positions of the German Guard were near the river, and the initial positions of our infantry on this side, and the distance between them was also no more than 100 meters. It was risky to conduct a massive fire on the positions of the enemy guard because of the dispersion of shells, which exceeded 100 meters. Their shells could hit their own troops, and this was unacceptable. Tasks to destroy enemy fire points on the opposite Bankard battalion and regimental artillery infantry, whose guns did not participate in artillery training. But the visibility of the battle was very poor because of the fog over the river. Besides, the Hitlerites' firing points were well buried in the ground and camouflaged. Regimental and battalion guns were firing direct fire at random, at the sound of enemy machine gun bursts, and the effectiveness of their fire was not high. Therefore, our infantry immediately had to fight fiercely on the other side, which often came to hand-to-hand combat. The offensive was difficult and slow. We managed to capture only a small bridgehead. There was a village there. We had a part of the village, the Germans had another part, who often counterattacked, trying to restore the situation and push our infantry into the river. They had tanks, and our infantry did not have tanks. There was no bridge for them, and the ferry could not be launched yet. The whole river was shot by machine gun fire, mortars and enemy artillery. The interaction of our artillery with the infantry was organized in such a way that with each battalion there was our battery commander, and with the regiment the division commander with control body scouts, liaison officers, calculators, and so on. Our division commander, Captain Savin Ivan Dmitrievich, with 2 battery commanders, 5th Kazimir Kaminsky and 6th Martyshov with scouts, radio operators, communicators, crossed to the bridgehead. I was ordered to stay on this bank and control the fire of the batteries on the commands of the division commander, which he was to transmit through me. In addition, I was obliged, in case of the death of those who had crossed to the bridgehead on their own, to make decisions for firing. Soon radio communication with the division commander was established. He began transmitting commands to me, and I transmitted them by field telephone to the firing positions. The fierce fighting on the other side continued all day. Although my NP was not far from the riverbank, at the local cemetery, the visibility was very poor because of the fog, and there was a wall of trees on that bank, so it was almost impossible to see what was going on there. Only by the sounds of machine gun bursts and shots of enemy tanks we could guess that the battle was going on somewhere in the center of the village. Our batteries were firing almost without respite. They had already fired hundreds of shells, but the enemy was resisting stubbornly. One counterattack follows another, and our batteries are firing all the time, supporting their paratroopers. Only in the evening, when it was already completely dark, some success appeared. Under cover of night, the enemy began to withdraw. Our infantry went to the far outskirts of the village, and there to consolidate. With dawn, the enemy, of course, will try to restore the situation, to dislodge our troops from the village. I received an order from the division commander to change NP and arrive on the outskirts of the liberated village. On a primitive ferry of several boats we crossed the Gron, and soon I took up an NP on the far outskirts of the village. The battle has quieted down, only separate shots and occasional machine gun bursts can be heard. The guards are not slumbering. Under the cover of darkness, the troops are crossing the bridgehead, even managed to transfer a few tanks. The night passed relatively quietly. In the morning, the battalion, which I support, rose to the attack. Together with the battalion commander moved, and I with my scouts, communicators, radio operators. The enemy is retreating. Sometimes bursts of fierce gunfire in one place or another. Obviously, the Nazis cannot break away from our troops to take a new line of defense and organize there a system of fire. We know that we cannot in any case give the enemy such an opportunity, otherwise we will have to break through his defense with all the undesirable consequences for us. To some extent, we are succeeding. Within 2 days from the beginning of the offensive, the enemy's defenses were broken through, and he began to hastily withdraw. Ahead are the Nitra and Wey rivers. They flow parallel to the River Gron, and the enemy will obviously organize the defense here. For forcing the River Gron and breaking through, the German defense regiments of the division were awarded orders, including our regiment, the 4th Guards Artillery, was awarded the Order of Kutuzov 3rd degree, and the personnel was announced the gratitude of Supreme Commander-in-Chief Stalin. The offensive of our troops continues. The weather is slushy mud, often there are tedious cold rains. By night it is freezing, clothes are damp and become stiff from the cold. It is good if we manage to find a stack of straw or at least some woods for the night, but most often we have to spend the night in the field. We dig dens in which we try to warm ourselves somehow. The enemy stops in villages for the night, and it is almost impossible to knock him out in the evening with our thinning forces. Several tanks and armoured personnel carriers of the enemy open frantic fire, not letting us near the village. In the darkness it is very difficult to detect them, especially since they are constantly changing position. We are advancing along the mountains. On our right, a kilometre away, the Czech Tatras begin. We are moving along the plain at the maximum pace for this time of year. The task is not to allow the Hitlerites to break away from us and gain a foothold on the opposite bank of the river Nitra. It is wider than the Gron and just as fast. It will not be easy to ford it. My battery is always on the move. I am with scouts and communicators in front, in the chain of the battalion. Fire platoons of the battery with guns follow 2 kilometers behind, in readiness, if necessary, to deploy and fire. When the enemy offers no resistance, the battalion rolls up in column and moves at maximum speed. My battery catches up with us and follows the battalion. We have to move almost all the time on country roads, and even in the fields, directly behind the battalion. The mud is up to the hub of the wheels. Horses and men are exhausted, overcoming the fields, and on the roads it is not easier. I'm on horseback. I have a beautiful large stallion of grey colour in apples, a trophy from the royal stables when we were advancing through Romania. Sometimes we manage to move on a paved road. My stallion, trained in the royal stables, makes beautiful pretzels. On the asphalt, moves one side or the other, then goes a beautiful trot, knocking out sparks with his hooves. Sometimes you can even see smoke from under his hooves. The infantry is on foot, so the battery makes stops it is necessary to inspect and feed the horses, check the harness. Leaving the platoon commander in the battalion, I went to the battery with my orderly, and there I did my business. I inspected the guns, horses. I had to talk to people. The population of the liberated Czechoslovak villages welcomes us very happily. Sometimes they block the street, detain us for some time. Spontaneous rallies arise, but most often the genuine joy of the local population turns into a small, cheerful celebration. Every resident, especially young people, tries to treat us with something light. Natural grape wine, bread, lard and other products are gladly accepted by the soldiers, especially since when there will be a kitchen, and whether there will be at all, it is difficult to say. The battalion has its own kitchen, and we have one kitchen for the whole division, and where it is unknown. So the soldiers do not get lost, enjoying the treats of grateful people. There are no problems with horse fodder either. At the end of March one evening, without a fight, we enter a large Slovak village. It stands in a gully. Behind the village there are heights. The enemy is entrenched there. His combat guard, as usual, launched one after another flares, fearing a surprise attack of our units. In the house where I and the battery stopped for the night came the chief of staff of our division, Captain Dergachev Pavel Vasilievich. I had long been chief of intelligence of the division, and we knew each other well. He informed me that the command decided to send to the rear of the enemy detachment consisting of a battalion, which I support, and my battery. The withdrawal to the rear of the enemy is scheduled for tonight. He offered me to go together to the battalion commander to clarify the task and organization of interaction. Together with the chief of staff went to the battalion commander. The night is dark, the sky is covered with clouds, drizzling fine rain. Once in a while an enemy rocket takes off, illuminating the nearby terrain with pale light. The enemy is no more than a kilometer away. Mud squelches under my feet, and I can't see the puddles in the darkness. I remembered that I have a trophy flashlight bug in my pocket. I am walking behind Dergachev. The flashlight is hidden in my sleeve, so that its light was not far visible. Otherwise you will certainly get a machine gun turn of the enemy, who can see the village well. I pressed the lever of the flashlight, and it buzzed as it should, illuminating the path we were walking on. The moment I switched on the flashlight, Dergachev falls to the ground and shouts to me, "Get down." Following him, I fall down next to him in the dirt. I ask Pavel Vasilievich what happened. He replies, "Didn't you hear it?" A mine rumbled. Obviously it didn't explode. My hearing is bad after a contusion. I might not have heard the sound of a falling mine. We got up. Pavel Vasilievich was cursing in silence. We got dirty in the mud. We go further. I pressed the flashlight lever again, and at the same moment Dergachev fell to the ground, dragging me with him. Again it did not burst. I reply that I heard nothing. He, as usual, replies that, say, a bear stepped on my ear. That's why you can't hear. When I turned on the flashlight for the third time, Dergachev smacked me in the ear, so that I could barely stay on my feet. He took the sound of my buzzing flashlight for an enemy mine, and only now realized that it was me and my flashlight that was to blame for the fact that we had fallen into the mud twice and got soiled from head to toe. He scolded me unkindly for this unpleasant episode and, continuing to grumble, took the flashlight from me, after which we moved on. Soon we arrived at the battalion commander's office. There was also the regimental commander, who set a task for our detachment. It consisted in that night to penetrate secretly from the enemy into his rear and, without getting involved in the battle, overnight to go as far as possible, deep into his defences. The next day we were to capture the railroad bridge over the River Nitra, the only one in our direction, and hold it until the Soviet troops approached. The battalion commander decided to move out at midnight. There were 25 kilometres to the River Nitra, and we had to reach it by morning. The task is not easy, although we are not accustomed to operate in the rear of the enemy. On preparation for the raid left no more than 3 hours. We have to do a lot of things. There, in the rear, every mistake can cost a lot, and there is nowhere to wait for help. We must rely only on our own forces. We'll move without roads directly so it's safer for the squad, but for me it's a great difficulty. The cannons will have to be dragged across the fields, across the ploughing. Each cannon is pulled by 6 horses harnessed in pairs, one pair after another in a tsuga. With such a cavalcade will not be easy. I gathered platoon and gun commanders, told them the task. Together we decide how to be, especially with sleds. I quickly thought over the proposals and decided to take only 2 horses for each gun and 1 horse-drawn wagon with ammunition for each gun. If necessary, the horses from the wagons can be harnessed to the gun harnesses. The battery is hastily preparing for the raid. The wheels of the guns and wagons are well greased. Tarpaulin carts with oats are prepared on the horses' heads so that they would not accidentally rumble, especially when we will pass through the enemy's front line. A lot of other little things at first glance, which should not be missed. Soldiers receive dry rations, breadcrumbs, lard and porridge concentrate in briquettes. The guns are inspected, ammunition is wiped clean of grease, etc. 2 guns and an ammunition platoon from the battery are going on the raid. The rest of the staff, together with the remaining horses, under the command of the battery petty officer, will move with the division. People are well aware of the complexity of the task, carefully prepare, there is no time to rest. At 23.00 the battalion begins to move toward the front of the enemy. Ahead of the reconnaissance, my battery follows the battalion, closing its column. On the outskirts of the village the column stops. There is no sound, especially not a light. Smoking is strictly forbidden. Responsible moment, will we be able to pass the front edge of the enemy unnoticed? The success of the task depends on it to a great extent. It is necessary that the enemy did not notice our detachment before the time. Languid minutes of waiting for the signal. Reconnaissance must silently destroy the enemy's combat guard. Our scouts have no experience in this business, but anything can happen. If you cannot do it quietly, it is unlikely that the squad will be able to fulfill the task. Most likely, we will have to fight to break forward, and this is a loss of suddenness of action and time. But here is a quiet whistle, a conditional signal, which means that the enemy's combat guard was destroyed silently, without a single shot, with only knives. The scouts, in order not to alert the Germans, continue to launch flares, which was done before by their combat guard. It also helps us. The terrain on the front of the enemy in the light of flares is viewed, and this allows my guns to pass through the enemy trenches without complications. The enemy's leading edge is passed. The squad is silently rushing deep into his defences. We move directly, without a road. The night chill has frosted the ground, and the horses confidently pull the guns, although 2 horses have to work for 6. Calculations help horses when it is necessary to overcome some obstacle, a trench, a ditch, a funnel, etc. Scouts worked well, not a single shot in our direction from the enemy, which means that our column is not detected. Flares at the front of the Germans were left far behind. The detachment stops. It is necessary to take a break, to wait for the scouts, who covered our column when it passed through the front edge of the enemy's defence from the flanks. We must check if no one has fallen behind. And I, in addition, need to give a break to people and horses which were going at maximum pace, almost running. Discipline is maintained strictly, not a sound, not a light. Soldiers talk only in whispers and only when necessary. Smoking is strictly forbidden. The soldiers themselves follow this, realizing that the violation of secrecy can lead to severe consequences. Scouts are approaching. Soon the column moves forward. I have a riding horse. I left my staff horse with the petty officer. The horse is well trained, follows all commands from the word, and it would be a pity to lose it. I took one of the horses of the gunnery harness under the saddle. If necessary, it can be harnessed to the gun if any horse is out of order. The battery closes the column of our detachment. Last comes the wagon of the second gun with ammunition. On it I have mounted a hand machine gun, a Dexiar as it is usually called. Surprise can arise from any side, and we must be ready to repel a sudden attack of the enemy. Soon we notice that on the right along the road, which our detachment began to cross, a column of vehicles with camouflaged headlights is moving. Part of the column, which did not have time to cross the road, including my battery, stopped. The soldiers lay down, prepared for battle. German vehicles pass without noticing us. The night is dark, the sky is covered with clouds, and this is to our advantage, although in the darkness we have to stumble and fall. We continue moving forward at a fast pace. Suddenly we heard a horse's hoof stomping behind us. I gave a command to the machine gunner to be ready. Soon a horse with a rider on it comes out of the darkness at full gallop. At full gallop the rider jumps off the saddle and falls to the ground. The horse rushed forward without the rider. We ran up to the rider. It turned out that it was the commander of the control platoon, Diminsky. When we started to get ready for the raid, he went to another house and fell asleep there. The battery petty officer, who remained in the village, accidentally discovered him and woke him up. Diminsky grabbed the first horse he could find, jumped into the saddle, and rushed to catch up with us. Later it turned out that it was my horse, which I had left with the petty officer. I scolded him properly. I had no time for him when we were going on the raid, and he had to take care of himself and his platoon. 2 hours had passed since we had gone behind enemy lines. Diminsky was riding our way. The horse, an intelligent animal, understood what was wanted from it, and found its way to the column by itself. At the same time, the fact that 2 hours after our exit the enemy did not find that his combat guard had been destroyed indicated that he did not yet know anything about our raid. Dawn was approaching, but it was still dark. The road has gone downhill. Ahead must be a river and a large village. It can be guessed by the barking of dogs and the singing of roosters. The village itself is not visible yet. It is impossible to bypass the village. There is a bridge only here in the village, so we'll have to fight our way through. So far our detachment has not been detected, and the suddenness is on our side, though it is, of course, a temporary factor. The column stops before reaching the village. We must pull it up and get ready for a fight. In such a large village there is undoubtedly a garrison, and evidently not a small one. Soon we moved forward. The road is gradually going downhill. The column is drawn into a deep and long gully, along the bottom of which the road runs. Its sides go steeply upward, rising to a height of 8 to 10 meters. I stop the battery. There is a village ahead, which means that any minute now a battle will break out, and I with my battery will find myself in a ravine, where the guns can't turn around, and there is no way back. I sent scouts ahead. They soon return and report that the ravine goes all the way to the village. I give the command to unhitch the harnesses and turn the guns in the other direction, that is, backwards. The sides are not high yet, and we manage, though with difficulty, to turn them around. We hitched the guns to the sledges and drove out of the ravine. At that moment a firefight started in the village. Obviously, our reconnaissance entered the battle with the enemy's guards. It is dark, nothing can be seen. Only flashes of shots and tracer bullets flying in all directions show that the battle is going on somewhere closer to the center of the village. I commanded the battery to move to the right of the ravine, take up a firing position, and prepare to fire. In the darkness the guns move into position. Enemy rockets help. In their light we manage to quickly take the position and turn the guns towards the village. The battle is already in full swing there. Machine gun and machine gun bursts, frequent bursts of hand grenades, shouts of hurrah can be heard. Tensely I look ahead into the village, but nothing is visible except for roofs and trees, which are sometimes caught by the light of another rocket. My guns are ready to fire, but it is dangerous to fire. You can hit your own. There is no news from Diminsky, who is with the battalion commander. Evidently, they themselves find it difficult to determine where the battle is going on. Here, all hope for the paratroopers. Acting in small groups, they attack, not allowing the enemy to come to his senses and seize the initiative. I sent forward Scout to find out the situation. In about 10 minutes he came running back and, out of breath, reports, or rather, shouts tanks. I tried to find out from him whose tanks and where they were. I immediately marvelled at the absurdity of this question. Whose tanks could be in the rear of the enemy, where the battalion started the battle? I questioned the Scout thoroughly. Where did he see the tanks? The Scout shows his hand to the left, behind the ravine, at the bottom of which is the road to the village, and where most of the battalion column is located. Until my eyes hurt, I look in that direction, where the Scout showed me, but in the darkness I can't see anything, and in the light of the enemy's rockets, away from them, the darkness seems even thicker. I send a Scout over the ravine with the task to clarify where the enemy tanks are. Through the crackle of machine gun and machine gun bursts, I sometimes hear the muffled sound of engines. Obviously, this is the target for my battery. I give the command tanks on the left. The crews hardly turn the guns to the left. The second gun must be rolled forward to the left, otherwise it will be at the back of the first one's head, because before that the guns were turned to the village. The second gun's crew is trying to roll it out, but it is not strong enough. I give a command to the first gun crew, and all who are here to help roll the gun out. The ground is sandy, there are small bushes everywhere, and the gun is moving forward with difficulty. The soldiers are pushing hard on the wheels. We must be faster. The tanks will not wait for us. Finally, we manage to roll the gun to a position suitable for firing. It is still dark. I run forward to the ravine, trying to see something in the darkness. Flashes of shots and rockets interfere. Finally, I hardly manage to see the movement of a dark heap, which looks more like a hay wagon. This is the enemy tank. It is about 150 to 200 meters away. I run back to the gun, try to show the gunner where the tank is, but he doesn't see it. Finally, in the pale light of another falling rocket, I manage to see a silhouette. I myself rushed to the gun sight panorama, rotating the panorama wheel. With difficulty, I found the dark spot of the tank. The gunner ducked to the panorama, saw the target. I give the command on the tank. Armor piercing, sight 12. Fire. The gun crew clearly fulfills the command. There was a deafening sharp sound of a shot. The flame of the shot blinded both me and the crew. But the sound of the shell hitting the armor, and then the sound of its ricochet confirmed that the shell hit the target. From the machine, a series of red rockets. I was even frightened at first. Did I really hit my tank? But immediately the thought prompts what their tanks can be here, in the rear of the enemy. I give a new command. Fire again. There is a sharp sound of a shot and again ricochet. I understood, obviously, it is a heavy Tiger. Our armor-piercing shells do not take it. While the red rockets were falling, I realized that there were 2 tanks moving there. By this time, my Scout reported that along the outskirts of the village 2 more tanks were approaching the exit from the ravine. I realized that Hitlerites intend to come from both sides of the ravine, squeeze the battalion column there, and crush it with tracks. There's no time to hesitate. I give the command Podkalaba. Fire. I run up to the second gun. Show the gunner the barely visible silhouette of the second tank. At this time, the first gun is fired. A characteristic sound is heard, as if the shell is bogged down in something. This indicates that the shell hit the tank. A shot of the second gun sounds, and again the same sound. Both tanks stopped. German tankers began to jump out of the tanks. In the heat of battle, I grabbed a hand machine gun, fell with it on the ground between the guns and started firing short bursts at the fleeing Germans. Our paratroopers from the battalion column, who until then had been anxiously watching the enemy tanks, emboldened by the powerful sounds of my gun's shots, rushed forward to the enemy tanks, catching the tankers. It is impossible to shoot from a machine gun. I remembered that I was, after all, the battery commander, not a machine gunner. But the youthful excitement of the battle worked, because I was only 21 years old. While my battery was fighting with tanks, it dawned. With binoculars, I tried to see what was being done in the village, where the main battle of our squad was going on. 2 other tanks, which moved along the outskirts of the village to the other end of the ravine, in which is part of our detachment, the kitchen of the battalion, wagons with ammunition, food, etc., are standing motionless. Apparently the battalion guns have dealt with them. Machine gun and machine gun bursts, grenade bursts are heard somewhere in the centre of the village. Our paratroopers are attacking house after house. Apparently there was a large German headquarters here, and the battle is fierce, but the initiative is on our side. I can see through binoculars as German soldiers, some half-undressed, white shirts on their backs, run out of the village on its far outskirts. They run to the straw stack that stands behind the village on the top. It is quite cool outside, obviously below zero, and the undressed Germans, of course, are cold, so they are hiding in the straw stack. From the side where we were firing at the tanks, apparently there is no danger. It is urgent to turn the battery towards the village. My battery men amicably piled on the guns. The first gun is turned 90 degrees and ready to fire. The second gun should be rolled out 50 meters to the right. All those who are not engaged at the first gun piled on the second. We can't fire at the village where the battle is going on. We might hit our own men. I decided to fire a few shots at the straw stack and set it on fire to warm up the Germans. I give the command on the straw stack behind the village, aim 40 to the first gun with incendiary shell fire. The first gun fired sharply and powerfully. The second gun fired at the other end of the stack. Howling shells fly above the stack and burst somewhere far behind it. With all my might I shout another command aim under the base of the stack, fire. Once again in the morning air the gun shot sounds powerfully. The shells hit the stack. I give the command 2 shells each, rapid fire once again the shot sounds, and the stack went up in smoke, and then the flames appeared. The Germans, like mice, began to jump out of the straw. They really looked like mice in their mouse-coloured overcoats. Under such an artillery cannonade our paratroopers fight even more fiercely. It is necessary to break through the village and continue to fulfill the main task. The bridge over the River Nitra should be captured before the Germans blow it up. The battle in the village is gradually quieting down. The battalion takes the defence on the far outskirts of the village. It is necessary to collect the column, deal with the wounded, hastily bury the dead and forward. I order the senior officer of the battery, Drogachenko, to take a circular defence. I myself with scouts go to the village, to the battalion commander to clarify the task. In the village, everywhere visible traces of battle-dead Germans, burning cars, broken wagons. In general, a familiar picture of the battle. I find the battalion commander. He thanked me warmly for such a loud support of the battalion's battle and for the tanks that had been hit. We briefly discussed the peripetειas of the battle. From his story I finally realized that the Germans really intended to squeeze the battalion in the ravine and strangle everyone with the tracks of tanks, and that in this village was really the headquarters of the German division. Many Germans, covering themselves with darkness and hiding behind coastal trees and bushes, fled from the village along the river. We have no time to pursue them. We must go faster forward to the Nitra River, which is about 15 kilometers away. We have now discovered ourselves, and the element of surprise will not help us, ahead of heavy fighting in the rear of the enemy. I send a scout to the battery with the order to dismount and trot to the far outskirts of the village where I am. It's already dawned, and it is possible that the Germans will call their air force and start bombing the village. We have to make it through in time. Soon the battery arrived safely to the specified place and camouflaged at the outskirts of the houses. The battalion in pre-combat order, that is in company columns, moved forward, followed by me and my battery. We pass over the height, on which the haystack set on fire by us continues to burn. Ahead in the haze we can see the next village. Up to it is about 4 kilometers. It is on the way of our route. We can't avoid fighting for it. Soon the field slammed bursts of enemy mines. The enemy began to get us from their mortars. The battalion is deployed in combat order, a chain. The enemy can strike from any direction. That's why the whole battalion with wagons, kitchen moves in one chain. My battery is immediately next to the battalion chain. The guns are built in a line, one from the other 50 meters along the front, ready to immediately deploy and direct fire to support the attack of the battalion. For the first time during the war, one see such a picture in one line of paratroopers. Between the company's wagons with ammunition and wounded, there is a smoking kitchen, which on the move is preparing breakfast for the battalion, here in my guns and wagons with shells. The battalion headquarters and the combat himself are also near the chain. Gradually we descend into the gully, and the distant village disappears from view, but the enemy can't see us. We are in the dead space, and the Germans can't fire at us. Battalion reconnaissance went forward. The gully comes almost to the village itself, and we can meet any surprise. Enemy mines slam left of the battalion. Obviously, the enemy does not see us and fires blindly. The lowlands allow us to approach stealthily almost to the village itself. The battalion mortars take up a firing position in the ravine to support the battalion's attack with their fire. My battery has nothing to do here. The village is less than a kilometre away, and it is impossible to fire from a closed position. We are moving on last year's ploughing. The horses can hardly pull the guns, so the soldiers are always on wheels helping the horses. When it is especially difficult, everyone in the battery lean on the wheels, because each gun with the front weighs more than 2 tons. We are climbing up the hill. We can already see the tops of the trees on the outskirts of the village, and soon the outskirts of the houses appeared. The enemy opened quite a strong rifle and machine gun fire. The enemy mortars continue to fire. Mines fall somewhere behind us. Sneezed our battalion mortars, firing at the enemy. I stopped the guns in the lowland, where enemy bullets do not reach, otherwise they can beat the horses from the harness and then trouble. We are about 200 meters away from the village. Our infantry is lying down. We have to take a break before the rush. Battalion mortars continue to fire at the enemy. Mines lie on the outskirts of the village, where his front line. Soon the battalion commander gives the command to attack. The soldiers of the battalion get up and run. A fierce cry of hurrah carries over the chain. The Germans are afraid of him, and you cheer yourself up with this shout. Here in the chain there are wagons, kitchen, and my guns. On the run we are shooting with automatic rifles and machine guns. I have a captured German machine gun. The scouts brought it when they fought for the village in the morning. I notice that I, together with everyone else, shout hurrah, hurrah, pouring machine gun fire on the outskirts of the village. Some single impulse draws us forward, to rush into the village faster, not to let the enemy come to his senses, and there our paratroopers have a lot of skill. The chain of the battalion is already at the outskirts of the vegetable gardens, where there were Hitlerites. Furious cues of our and enemy automatic rifles and machine guns, claps of hand grenades, here and there shouts of hurrah. This is our paratroopers storming the enemy defence. I look back. My guns with sledges are near the chain of the battalion, rushing as long as the horses have enough strength. I shook my fist at the senior officer. He waved his hands. The excitement of the battle did not keep either soldiers or horses in place. I sent a scout, ordered the senior officer to quickly hide the harnesses with the guns at the nearest houses, which had already been taken by the battalion. There is no serious work for my battery yet, but I keep everyone in readiness to immediately turn around and support the battalion's actions with fire. Gradually the battle in the village subsides. The enemy could not withstand our friendly and fierce attack and leaves, covered by outlying houses and trees. The battalion is positioned in the centre of the village and on its far outskirts. They hastily summarize the battle, give first aid to the wounded, as if there are no dead. The kitchen soon begins to give out breakfast, the usual front life. A battle is a battle, but it is necessary to be refreshed. My battery on the near outskirts of the village also settled down for breakfast. We have no kitchen, only dry rations, but resourceful soldiers have already got hot food from the battalion kitchen and brought it to me. Having had a quick snack, I left the village. There was a ridge of heights to the right of us behind the village. I couldn't see what was there. I had to look. I climbed to the crest of the height ahead are arable lands, hills, some trees, plantings. A small village is visible in the distance in the haze. It is about 3 kilometers away. I look through binoculars and suddenly I see a chain of soldiers moving from the village towards us. They are about 800 to 900 meters away. It was hard to see what kind of a chain, whose chain it was. I lay down on the ground, looking carefully through the binoculars. I realized from the outline of helmets on the soldiers' heads that they were Germans. I ran away to the side, lay down on the ground. I had the same German machine gun. I took aim and gave a line at the distant chain. Soldiers fell to the ground, so I got it. But soon the officer lifted the chain, and it began to move towards us again. I gave a few more bursts. To my right, about 100 meters away, a fountain of earth, the explosion of an enemy mine, and then 2 more explosions, one in front and one behind. So I hit an artillery fork. The next mine is mine. I quickly ran away to the side. I managed to cover 25 to 30 meters. As on the place where I was lying there was a fountain of earth again, a mine rupture. I jumped up and ran back to the village where my battery was. I did not do my job. I have a battery, and I am its commander, but the youthful excitement even here pushed me to do what I should have done. But there's no time to think. I sent a scout to inform the battalion commander about the enemy. Soon the battalion and my battery moved forward. We cannot get involved in a fight at this line. Sleepless night and fatigue presses, but we must endure, and the soldiers, well aware of this, do everything to fulfill the task. For 3 or 4 hours we are advancing almost without stopping. Only sometimes, then in one place or the other erupt short, fierce skirmishes with separate groups of the enemy. He has evidently lost sight of us, or does not have sufficient forces in the neighbourhood to block our way. But let the enemy's head ache about that, and we must accomplish our task. Soon a railroad bridge across the river appeared in the distance. It's about 1 kilometre away. That's our main objective. Battalion and my battery, with the maximum possible speed for us, go to the bridge. The width of the river Niter in this place meters 150 to 200. The flow is very fast, up to the mountains 3 or 4 kilometres, and the speed of the flow as in a mountain river. A short burst of fighting with a small group of the enemy guarding the bridge, and it is in our hands. The battalion commander organises the defence. My battery takes a position in the fighting order of the detachment. The soldiers of the gun crews are entrenching themselves. We have to dig trenches for the guns, ditches for sheltering the units, etc. There is enough work, but everyone knows well that the price of this work is life. In case of an enemy air raid or a battle with ground forces, without a trench is certain death. No one has to convince or push anyone. It so happened that the events about which I am writing now took place exactly 50 years ago. Today is April 4th, 1995. Of course, many details of those battles have already been forgotten and obviously cannot be recalled. But that is not important. The main thing is that we then, acting behind enemy lines, fulfilled our task. We captured the bridge unharmed and held it until the approach of our troops. Our raid through the German rear, obviously, played an important role. In any case, in the offensive zone of our division, the enemy began to hastily withdraw. Soon our detachment joined the main forces of the division, and we together with all the others continued the offensive through the territory of Czechoslovakia, now in the direction to the northwest, to Prague.